talking about how can we safeguard staff well-being post-COVID. Claire is qualified as a clinical psychologist, and she qualified in 2004 and spent most of her career working in complex medical health teams in Bristol and South Wales. She moved to work in North Bristol Trust in the staff psychology team in 2020, after an increasing awareness that without supporting staff and teams to be well and connected, it's hard for them to support their patients. So I'm looking forward to Claire's talk on this. Welcome, Claire. Thank you very much indeed for getting involved with our conference, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Richard. Hopefully you can all see my slides. Perhaps someone let me know if you can't. So when I was given this title, it sounds quite an intimidating title, really. How can we safeguard staff well-being post-COVID? I don't claim to have all the answers at all, nor do my team, but we're lucky enough to have a team of psychologists working purely to support staff in North Bristol Trust, which I know is a bit of a luxury around the country. Hopefully that is changing. But what I will talk about is some of the driving concepts behind the support we have tried to give to staff, particularly over the last 2 years, and some of the ways we've tried to embed those ideas, which we're completely willing to share with anybody who would like to see the things that we've developed in a bit more depth. So please do get in touch. So the context, Rachel set that amazingly this morning with her very emotive accounts of her experience through COVID. This diagram here is developed by the King's Fund, and it gives a kind of track that most people follow through a disaster. The top of the screen where the line goes up, it's when we've got emotional highs, and at the bottom it's emotional lows. So pre-disaster, what often happens is that kind of adrenaline pumping, feeling threatened and anxious, but also that adrenaline and cortisol giving us energy. Then there is often a heroic kind of push to an urge to act, and community cohesion, people coming together to want to help one another, to want to help colleagues, patients. After that high, after that peak, we often fall into disillusionment, especially if that pressure continues for some time, like COVID has. We've gone in and out of waves. I don't know what wave we're in now, but it hasn't gone away, has it? And then we can hit a lower emotional energy, so where disillusionment can happen. If we have things that trigger that initial kind of trauma or disaster, it can make a whoosh in our emotions and feelings, as can anniversary reactions, sort of times and events that remind us of what we've been through. In normal times, what will happen after a time is then we start to assimilate what we've experienced, what we've learnt. We'll come together, we'll reassess who we think we are, how we experience the world, and a reconstruction can happen in that time. Obviously, COVID has not fitted this nice, neat pathway. It's gone up and down, up and down. And now, as Rachel talked about this morning, staff are now left with huge waiting lists and pressures at a time when they do need to be recovering. This is a very probably overused analogy, this picture, but it's just to remind us that perhaps even if we've all been in the same storm, which is the COVID pandemic, we've been in very different boats, and those boats represent our personal resources, the resources we have where we work, all around us in our families. We've all been in very different situations, even though we've been following the same course in the pandemic. We also use this kind of imagery in our team about how we all carry invisible rucksacks when we go about our day-to-day. So before we even come into work, we have these rucksacks on our back. And in these rucksacks are all the pressures from our home life, from things from the past, from perhaps things we're worried about that are coming up in the future. And sometimes the rucksacks can feel completely manageable, like this guy here. He's managing to text or whatever he's up to at the same time. Sometimes they can feel more like this poor lady's, full of, other things, other pressures from outside of work as well as inside. And the accumulative day-to-day grind of work can do this as well. And depending on how heavy, how full our rucksacks feel, is dependent on how well we're able to manage then the challenges that come in front of us. And it's important to be compassionate to ourselves, that check in, how full is my rucksack right now? And also our colleagues. So if people are reacting more snappily, less helpfully than usual, think about, what might they be carrying? Because nobody chooses to show up to work in that way. We also, whenever we think about helping staff teams, we remind our staff that the context we work in, even in normal times, even pre-COVID, even as we move out of this, the work is not normal by many people's standards. It becomes normal to all of you working in these kind of environments, but it's not. There was a management term that was bandied around sort of late 80s and to describe difficult and challenging workplaces, and it's this acronym VUCA. And the V is volatile, the U is uncertain, the C is complex, and the A is ambiguous. And when you have all of those things turned up, that's when you have a challenging work environment. And it doesn't take a leap to see how, even in normal times, that is how busy healthcare is in the NHS. And we do this to normalise the pressures, to speak up about them, like Rachel encourages to do, and to validate the staff that we work with, that even normally the work is tough, the work is pressured. So I'm going to talk a bit more about some useful driving concepts that we try and weave into anything that we've tried to help staff with in the last couple of years. We've developed a bit of a tagline for our service, and that is resilience is between us, not just within us. The reason for this is we really, really want to get away from the idea of resilience being an individual quality. Of course, we can do things to turn up our own resilience and to bolster ourselves, but sometimes the pressures are so great and the work is so difficult, it's just not fair to talk about whether we're resilient or not. And it can become a stick to beat ourselves with, why aren't I feeling more resilient? Everyone else is dealing with this. We hear that a lot from staff who come to us individually. They literally say, why am I not coping? Everyone else is dealing with this. But we've actually now heard that hundreds and hundreds of times. So I think what is more close to the truth is that we come into work, we zip up, we put on that front, and we get on. We don't talk about often just how pressured and how difficult things can be. So we need to move more towards supporting one another, talking to one another. We can't always be showing up, having our best day every time we come to work. So we need to perhaps let colleagues know that perhaps can you look out for me today, or I might not be able to work in this area today. I'm going to talk about psychological safety in a moment, and Professor Amy Edmondson is the lady who coined that term, and a quote here from her that what really matters was less about who was in the team and more about how the team worked together and treated one another. That came from a study called Google Aristotle, where Google looked at hundreds of teams to try and work out what is it that makes the most effective team. And what they found across all these teams outside of healthcare and inside is this thing called psychological safety. If you get this going in a team, you get an innovative and effective and a well team. It doesn't matter how educated people are, what experience they've had, who is on the team. If you haven't got this, you don't have a well-functioning team. And what psychological safety means, I'm sure a lot of you know this already, but it's that shared belief that the team is safe enough to take into personal risks. It's okay to speak up and suggest changes, notice mistakes, challenge each other in a compassionate, sensitive way. And then you get change, you get effectivity, and you get teams that are thriving and not just surviving. So another quote from Amy Edmondson here. The most important influence on psychological safety is the nearest boss. Signals sent by people in power are critical to employees' ability and willingness to offer their ideas and observations. So this is talking to how people who work as leaders, as managers in healthcare, have a really important role in looking after our staff. Another important driver to everything that we try to provide for our staff is Professor Michael West's ideas of compassionate leadership. He talks about what people need generally to be well in work, and particularly in healthcare settings, are this ABC. A is for autonomy, so the need to have control over our work lives and act consistently with our personal values. Obviously, the NHS is a huge beast of an organisation and we can't possibly have complete autonomy, but just a feeling that our voice matters in the teams that we work in, that people listen to what we have to say, that we have enough control, that we can book holidays when we need to, we can go home when we need to, we can balance up our work-home life. The B is for belonging. And so we need to feel that we're connected to a team or an organisation or an endeavour that matters, and to feel that we're noticed and that we're valued within that. And the C is competence. So the need to feel that our work is worthwhile and we're able to do our role effectively. Rachel spoke really powerfully earlier of that idea of moral distress, when you feel like you're not offering the care as you would like to offer it. So people dying without their family around them, and the efforts that her team made to try and bridge that gap. But competence, we need to feel like we're doing something worthwhile and useful. Michael West talks about the way that we can be compassionate with staff and our colleagues and our leaders is to attend. So to really listen to our colleagues, listen to our staff, to hear what they've got to say, to try and really understand, and then to try and empathise, to try and understand what it means to them, how it feels for them. And then this helping box is to have an urge to act, an urge to do something to make that better for the person. We've also added a box appreciating. I think it comes into some of Michael West's boxes, but we feel that it's important and should stand alone as its own thing. So we talk about this as a way of being compassionate to each other as well. I don't know if it rings true for you, but I know even on the most challenging of days, if somebody says something like, I noticed that was really tricky and I think you handled it really well, or I've noticed how hard you worked, that it just makes a difference. We can go home feeling differently. So compassionate leadership, important. We also draw on this 3 circles model, which was from Professor Paul Gilbert from Compassion Focused Therapy. And he talks of how we exist in these 3 circles of functioning. We need all of them. They're like a 3-pronged stool. If we lose one of them, we can manage for a bit, teetering around, but it takes effort and we topple eventually. So there's the threat system. That's where adrenaline, cortisol is released. It's an urge to act and to do something when we experience threat, whether that's pressure of work, whether that's anxiety of what we're dealing with. The drive system is where we set ourselves goals. And when we meet those goals, it releases dopamine. We feel good. It keeps us thriving for those goals. The soothing system, that's where oxytocin is released. It's where we get that shoulder drop. It can often be when we connect in with people that matter to us, or when we're doing something that is truly in the moment, playing music, doing exercise purely for exercise sake, being outside, or stroking a pet, whatever it is. What we find, though, in our staff, and particularly the last few years when there's felt so much threat around, is that we find people oscillating between the threat system and the drive system, feeling that threat, pushing into drive. If I just do a bit more, if I stay a bit longer, if I get to the end of this list. And it's a way of people trying to feel in control of that threat. And people see this soothing system as something, well, that would be nice, but I'll do it, when I get time, when I move on from, when I get to the end of what I'm doing. And what we try to do is try and invite people to see that differently, that it's not a nice add-on. It's something that we need to survive a busy and a pressured working life. So now I'm going to talk a bit about some of the ways we've tried to embed some of those ideas into work in NBT. So North Bristol's Wellbeing approach, it's a bit small. I don't know if you can read all of this, but it's a pyramid-based system where we try to, at the bottom of the pyramid, is trying to get basic needs met for all staff. So people can take a break, they can have enough, they can eat, they can have a rest. And we try where we can in the psychology team to influence our chief execs and sitting in our meetings and trying to help think about how to get those basic needs met. Moving up the pyramid is how we try to encourage teams to look after one another. So we put in various training about how teams can do that. And then right at the top of the pyramid is specialist psychological intervention, where we can see people individually. We have various training in different trauma interventions like EMDR, or just seeing people for some coaching. But that's at the top of the pyramid. We want to try and help get the rest of it right first. The code at the top of this is a paper written by Jo Daniels. She worked alongside us and then wrote up this paper, particularly describing this model as a way of looking after frontline doctors through the pandemic. So our wellbeing approach, we try to think about how we can help people individually in self-care. So we have the individual sessions. In team care, we go into teams and try and help teams. And then organizational care, how can we influence the culture? So this is one intervention that we've developed through COVID. It's called Me and My Team. There's an email address at the bottom if you're interested in receiving this pack. We've made a pack that goes along with 2 coaching style sessions that we offer to our managers and leaders, with the idea being that they can then help their staff, and they are culture carriers in our organisation. And they talk through what we call our 4 golden threads. So psychological safety, diversion and inclusion, values-based action, and the power of compassion. So we introduce those concepts to our managers, leaders, and then we talk with them about how to tailor that to their environment and how to turn up these things in their environment. If you're interested in this, please get in touch with the team, and we're happy to share. Another initiative, which was alongside our lovely QI colleagues and nursing and medical staff, was developed in COVID again, and we called it Start Well, End Well. And it's a way of trying to weave in some of these concepts and ideas into the everyday. And it's a 3-step model, but that can be adapted depending on the setting. So where there might be a normal handover or a checkout, trying to weave in some of this other stuff, like making sure we introduce ourselves, because there's lots of change and different teams coming together through COVID, making sure everyone knows who everybody is, knows what their job is for the day. And then in the checkout, thinking about who can we thank and what do we need to hand over, as well as the more kind of strategic and operational things that need to be checked off. The middle step is the peer-to-peer pit stop, and we've developed some training around that, and that's helping staff do hot debriefs if they need to in the middle of a day, just for up to 15 minutes. And again, it's about how to weave in some of these concepts that I've talked about into doing the kind of more operational debrief. So thinking about what have we done well, what do we need to do for the rest of the shift, how are we going to look after one another? And various teams and wards have taken this on and adapted them for their own needs. Again, there's a different email address at the bottom of this slide, and if you're interested in seeing or getting in touch with the team that have been delivering this, we're very happy to share it. And I think so far, 150 different teams around the country have requested this pack and have been interested in what we've been doing. We've also recently been developing our staff trauma support, and we're seeing it as a pathway, a bit like the pyramid. So at the beginning of the pathway, we're helping teams skill up themselves to be able to look after one another. So using the Start Well, End Well to weave into check-ins and check-outs, looking after one another. We've developed some trauma awareness training that we're hoping to try and take to most teams and wards, so people can just be aware of what you might expect as a trauma reaction, to help kind of normalize what people feel and know where to go for extra support if they need. So the pit stops I've just talked about. We've also joined up some of our staff trauma inbox with Datex. So now if there is a Datex that is recorded where it's there's been some sort of interpersonal reaction, that will automatically come to our trauma inbox, where we can then facilitate checking in with people, about how they are and whether they need any support. And then right at the end of this pathway is the access to psychological support. So if people are stuck with their trauma, we can use interventions to help them move on. So I've rattled through that, but our take-home messages at the end of this presentation are back to our tagline. Number 1, resilience is between us and not just within us. So we are more and more, as well as doing the reactive, helping people when they are struggling, really want to do the preventative work as well. One thing I haven't mentioned is we've set up various monthly facilitated peer supervision groups for doctors, also for some other teams that have requested it, just as a way of people connecting with one another, normalising that the work is challenging, and hopefully being a bit preventative in measure rather than waiting until people have a challenge. And we've had good uptake for that. Second message, staff wellbeing is intrinsically linked to patient safety. I'm sure you've been talking about that throughout the day, and Rachel ended her talk with that. If you don't feel well looked after and supported as a staff team, it's incredibly hard to then bring that compassion to your patients and that care. Number 3, compassionate leadership and role modelling are key. So invest in supporting the supporters. So we've there's only a small number of us, so we've tried to put effort into supporting our leaders, our managers, our doctors, as well as other staff, but particularly focused on those groups. Weave wellbeing skills and psychological safety into routine processes to help embed them. You know, people are busy, and it's a luxury to hope, you know, we do put on bespoke training and people do come and we come into teams, but also we want to try and weave it into the everyday, like with the Start Well, End Well, like with the Skilling Up managers to help their teams. Encourage conversations around what matters. So like Rachel's encouraged, talk to each other about things that are difficult, and we encourage our staff and our teams to do that. And also giving permission and commitment to look after yourselves alongside what you're doing to look after others. So trying to shift people's view of, you know, we're above these normal human responses to pressure, trying to encourage people that we need to look after ourselves, and we need to give permission to our colleagues to look after themselves as well. Okay, that's me.
Thank you very much, Claire. It sounds as if your staff at North Bristol are very well looked after. Very, very lucky. Be interesting to know how your work is parallel around the country. If you're just thinking back on your first draft of your response to COVID, where do you think we currently are in the phases of disaster response?
Yeah, well, I think that first of all, people are in different places, I think, depending on where you are in the country, where you are in your own personal journey with it. We have also put effort into trying to support staff that have been shielding through this pandemic as well. And obviously, as they have been returning to work, they're in a very different phase from people who have been in all the time. But I would say, as a broad brush, we're perhaps in the disillusionment, starting to get into the recovery a little bit, but trying to appreciate, you know, the pressures that are still on everybody.
A comment that one of the delegates has made is so much work needs to be done culturally to encourage colleagues to look after the soothing system.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
You've obviously done a lot. Yeah.
We often, whenever we go into groups and we share that, we ask people, so how in balance are you? I think it's very, very few of us that can say that. Yeah.
In terms, just one last question. In terms of safeguarding or giving support to the staff against moral injury and moral distress, how do you see that being performed? Is that working through psychologists and actually having psychological support for that?
Well, I think we initially would encourage this peer-to-peer support, and like Rachel was talking about this morning, just acknowledging to each other that the work is tough. Like I said earlier in my talk, so many people come through and feel that everybody but them are coping. and we kind of have to do that in a way to get on with our jobs. But I think there is a real power in sharing that. But if those traumas are building to the point where it's difficult to let it go, then there are absolutely really effective interventions that we can offer as psychologists to help people work through that. I think it's validating and normalizing the response to that as well.
Claire, thank you very much indeed. That was really excellent. Right, I would like to I will just talk to the delegates about feedback, which I haven't done so far. We'd really appreciate your feedback, please, to help us to plan future conferences. You're going to find a link to the form pinned at the top of the event chat. And once you've completed it, you'll receive an email with a link to the poster, presenter and attendance certificate. So if you can look out for that, and in the next half hour, if you could complete the feedback form, that'd be fantastic. Now we're just going to have a 15-minute break while we go back and have a look at the runners-up and the first prizes for the poster competition, and we will be back on the main stage to announce both the winners and the runners-up in 15 minutes. See you then.